Needless to say, the subject of my last video was very, well, frustrating. The more I played Breakpoint, the more I succumbed to the effects of wistful affection for something that I used to enjoy. I realized the more I dreaded away at the game, the more my nostalgia-tinted glasses were gradually tilting onto my nose. It wasn't long till I was gazing through their saturated lenses that turned my computer room into a blooming field with sugar canes and rivers of chocolate. It was then I found myself playing through old Ghost Recon games to get a whiff of what originally made them so compelling to me.
If you've seen that video, it should be pretty evident that I spent a lot of time with Advanced Warfighter 1 and 2. But as making that video came to a close, there was something I realized I needed to come back to. This stellar third-person shooter had a PC release as well, but it's not quite as simple as the 360 version being ported over. This thing is an entirely different beast, and while I was aware of this version already, I had never played it, and the only coverage I could find on it was pretty ancient by internet standards. And then, whilst I was researching that version, I found myself scrolling through the game's Wikipedia page and startled by another revelation.
Advanced Warfighter had another release on the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox, and further investigation revealed that this was no mere port, and like the PC version, was an entirely different game.
A light bulb went off above my head, and I realized the motivation for this man's content. Just when I thought the nostalgia trip was over in the last video, I realized I needed to jack myself back into the nostalgic machine and analyze each version of this game.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Here's a quick introduction. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter was released in March 2006 exclusively on the Xbox 360. It would be one of the first next-generation third-person shooter experiences on the 7th generation consoles, and it launched to rave reviews, with publications like Game Trailers, rest in peace, giving out its highest score yet, and Game Informer saying things like, "Advanced Warfighter is a game I would recommend without hesitation to all shooter fans, and is easily one of the best titles in the 360 library." At least for the time, early 2006, there certainly was no other third-person shooter with the production value of GRA. But something that was overshadowed by GRA's glamorous launch on the 360 was its very different adaptations on last-gen consoles and PC, which were not recipient to the same applaudful reception or even attention for that matter. This game launched in an interesting time between console generations, where in order to fully capitalize on a release, publishers would push a version out on every major platform. Nothing too crazy to grasp there, but rarely do games that launch between console transitions go through the type of treatment Advanced Warfighter did. Whereas instead of finding the means to port altered versions to the less powerful consoles and PC, Ubisoft found it more practical to have tailored versions of the game created for those platforms with a fraction of the 360's production value. All of these versions still check the boxes required to at least emulate the 360 experience, but they are all fundamentally different for various reasons. Advanced Warfighter is very peculiar in this regard, because there aren't many examples of essentially entirely different games made underneath the title of one, at least when it comes to home consoles and PC. I'm going to be taking an in-depth look at all these adaptations of the same game and see how they've translated the advanced warfighting experience to their respective systems. The year is 2013. It is the future. The Xbox One is about as appealing as a broken VCR, and people are making memes about Beyonce at the Super Bowl. You are Captain Scott Mitchell, leader of a Ghost Recon team. You've been sent into Mexico City to stop rebels from overthrowing the established government. They've already succeeded in capturing the US president, obtaining a device known as Guardrail 9 that disrupts wireless communication, and threatening security in the region. The story remains unchanged throughout the three versions, and although some missions play out entirely different between them, we're solely going to be looking at the qualities of the gameplay and presentation, as Advanced Warfighter's story isn't really much of a selling point.
Okay guys, you gotta hump it the rest of the way. Over there is the president's last known position.
So, to begin with, we're going to be looking at the 360 version. For those unfamiliar, Advanced Warfighter on the 360 is a third-person semi-tactical shooter that builds on the focus of linear levels and tense firefights that debuted in Ghost Recon 2. It's obvious that this version was the one with the most money and time allocated to it, and it would serve as a template for the other versions to adapt. It's immediately apparent that what sets GRA's Xbox 360 version apart is its over-the-shoulder third-person perspective. Although there is an option to play in first person, it's obvious this was the viewpoint that the game was built around, just like in Ghost Recon 2. What comes with this perspective is a cover system very akin to Gears of War that grants you the ability to snap to cover, blind fire, and move along surfaces. Thanks to the very lethal damage model, GRAW holds an emphasis on positioning yourself where there is the least chance of an enemy being able to hit you. This makes taking advantage of angles and using the best sightlines to your enemies a necessity, and things that a cover system isn't really the most optimal for. The game's open levels offer a lot of flexibility, so you won't really need to be snugging up and attaching yourself to every surface like you do in the likes of Gears or Uncharted, but rather angling the camera around corners cautiously while aiming with precision. Although the cover system does get a lot of use when you're forced to defend an area and when using the gun cam rifle that allows you to shoot accurately from cover without exposing yourself. But it should be clear it's not really this type of game. The damage model is by far one of the most punishing out of any contemporary shooter I've played in a while. A couple shots is all it takes to put you down, with higher difficulties only allowing you to take a single bullet. Luckily, this isn't made overwhelmingly difficult thanks to AI that aren't nearly as accurate as previous enemies in the series. You shouldn't expect to be instantly sniped for stepping into one of these guys' crosshairs, but clumsiness certainly doesn't go without punishment. Thankfully, GRAW isn't really one of those games that require you to hold a magnifying glass up to every pixel of the screen to spot your enemy. The difficulty of target acquisition in a game with fast sightlines and enemies littered throughout the environment is alleviated by the cross-comm user interface. Thanks to this, enemies will be outlined and colored as long as they are nailed to proximity to you or a teammate, heightening your situational awareness. Although there isn't a way to turn it off, I believe this to be the biggest contributor to GRAW's accessibility, as playing with it turned off in GRAW 2 made the game far more challenging. Luckily, in the war-ravaged streets of Mexico City, you aren't the only one that needs to worry about sticking their head out. Thanks to Advanced Warfighter's arsenal of near-future weaponry, you have all kinds of ways to put down those filthy rebels. All the firearms at your disposal are intently lethal, with the rebels you go up against usually taking no more than a couple rounds to put down. Every weapon recoil is appropriately wide, which makes tight trigger control a constant consideration, but not enough to prohibit the use of automatic fire. The 360 version has by far the most satisfying gun battles, with environments large enough to encourage a lot of experimentation, and the weapons themselves delivering on all the cracks and bangs you'd expect to hear from their real-life counterparts. Side note, something I find very interesting is that in a lot of these near-future shooter games with military themes that released around the same time as GRAW, is that they would often feature prototyped weapons, but namely the XM8 since it was a contender to become the next standard issue rifle for the US military, as well as a whole other bag of guns. This never came to fruition, and even the most specialist of special forces still primarily use the M4 to this day. Throughout missions and prior to beginning them, Mitchell will be able to resupply and change his weapon along with those of his teammates. Something I will criticize this version for though is something that luckily was fixed in the sequel. There is a wide variety of weapons with different configurations, but most of the time they are locked out depending on the level, restricting your access to only a couple of weapons that are recycled throughout the course of the campaign. I don't have a huge issue with this, but sometimes I'd find the weapon setups for certain missions not very preferable. Luckily, if you are in a pickle, you can pick up enemy weapons that are all around effective, and if things are truly scarce, your sidearm can be surprisingly effective. All the missions in the single player are relatively linear, taking place in largely urban environments with straightforward objectives. You'll be dismantling transmitters, taking out tanks, to defending buildings and saving hostages. GRAW's combination of squad-oriented gameplay and third-person shooting lends itself well to the by-the-number military objectives you go up against. And with the use of the cross-comm interface, which not only marks enemies, but gives you indirect control over friendly assets, whether that be Bradleys, Abrams, Apaches, or other fire teams of Ghost, levels can play out surprisingly more dynamic than you'd expect from this type of game. This gives GRAW's combat an additional layer of strategy that definitely enhances the action. Controlling your squad is very simplistic and easily accessible, very similar to another beloved tactical shooter with an emphasis on action. Like Republic Commando, you control your squad entirely with hot buttons on the D-pad. Unfortunately, there isn't much sophistication in the tactics you can employ with your teammates in this version, as you are limited to two very basic commands, a movement order and a regroup order. You can also give specific targets to your squad to shoot at, and if they are fitted with the right kit, you can designate them to take out larger threats like tanks or APCs by pressing up on the D-pad. This simplicity is great at keeping the action going, but is often bogged down by the terrible friendly AI. This is one area of Advanced Warfighter that was criticized upon release, and for good reason. These guys may look like professional soldiers, but they have the motor skills of the Three Stooges. Instead of following your orders, they'd rather bamboozle you by standing in doorways, daydreaming when enemies walk right past you, blowing themselves up with rocket launchers, and strategically moving into the crosshairs of enemy machine gun nests. One by fucking one. Luckily, this is yet another thing that was fixed in Advanced Warfighter 2, but these dimwits really do hurt the experience a fair bit, especially when you're counting on them to draw some fire for you, which honestly is the only thing they're really great for. To make things even worse, their mapping is terrible. Your squad mates will routinely take the most illogical path to reach places only a few feet away from them, and with bullets flying all around, they often wound up dead. Make no mistake, these guys are trash. Get used to lone wolfing it.
Firing! He's down, Captain. Attack! Firing! I'm down!
Luckily, the supporting assets you're sometimes granted don't inspire similar feelings. Some missions you'll be given control to tanks or IFVs that will assist you. Through the cross-comm, you can control them along a predetermined path by telling them to move forward, stop, or move backwards. Additionally, you can give specific targets just like you can for your fire team. These parts of Advanced Warfighter are perhaps the most engaging, as you have to protect the armored units from infantry threats that they're unable to reach. This makes coordination very important, as some areas can be near impossible to complete with the help of these types of units. It's in these levels where you're multitasking between numerous units in a large battlefield that really showcase this game's sandbox. As I said before, Grot's 360 version has an incredible production value for a game released in 2006 and is by far the best looking version of the game. The single player levels are not only vast but incredibly detailed, all while running very smoothly on an Xbox One. Real-time lighting effects are sublime and really help to sell the hot, sunny battleground of Mexico City. Gun battles feel startlingly grounded while being visually stimulating thanks to excellent particle effects that draw each bullet's trajectory and impact. There are some muddy textures here and there, but the amount of detail on screen is impressive, especially considering the size of the levels. If there was anything negative to say, is that if it weren't for the sleekness of the cross-comm, this would be one very brown game, and the environments do begin to feel repetitive. I think the most impressive feat of this version's presentation has to be the superb animation quality. Something I find rare in third-person games outside of a couple shining examples is a sense of inertia that enhances your input. While you're almost always fixed on Mitchell's backside, the camera and animations all blend very well to make you feel like you're following him rather than controlling him at times. Mitchell moves realistically as you'd expect from a real soldier, whether he's running, stopping to aim, taking cover, firing his weapon, or giving orders. Everything feels smooth and not overly exaggerated, and personally, I find it makes the archaic firefights all the more engrossing. At times, I truly felt like I was playing a war movie with a camera attached onto Mitchell's backside, a feeling I can only really compare to when watching movies like Sicario or Act of Valor. In addition, the excellent sound design adds to the sense of weightiness that Mitchell has. Things like the heavy sounds of his uniform's many pieces moving together, along with the sounds of boots stepping over concrete or into dirt, all add to the immersion.
Yeah, that sounds good, doesn't it?
This combined with the excellent animation work make Grot's single player feel very realistic, even if it's not.
RPG! The roof! Damn it, RPG on the roof!
We've got friendlies on the way.
If you have Advanced Warfighter on the 360, I'd say it certainly is worth replaying. It's one of the best titles in the Tom Clancy catalog and is very underrated as far as third-person shooters go. I'd say this game is absolutely worthy of the A+ tier. And when you're finished with it, you should play Grot 2, which is absolute S tier. Best babe, hands down. But anyway, you'd think with how stellar the 360 version of this game is, that the PC version would be all sorts of leaps and bounds better. It might come as a surprise then that that couldn't be farther from the truth. This version of the game was worked on by Swedish-based developer Grin, who would later go on to become Overkill Studios, the creator of the Payday series. And it's fair to say that this was the biggest project that they had worked on at the time, besides a couple of niche racers. Powered by a very early version of the diesel engine, which Overkill would use again for Payday, Graw's PC adaptation doesn't have the same sleek presentation as its console counterpart. In fact, it's missing a lot of what made the 360 experience what it was. This results in a game that, instead of merely adapting the gun-toting action of the 360 version, is something much more akin to the original Ghost Recon and Rainbow Six, with more an emphasis on elaborate planning and deeper tactical gameplay. Levels are far more open, squad commands are given far more depth, and the difficulty is spiked all the way up.
APCs are now on the scene. We could really use some help. Mitchell, what's your status?
Whereas all the fundamentals that made the 360 version a tight third-person shooter sprinkled with tactical elements that called back to the original Ghost Recon, the PC version makes those tactical elements the primary focus.
I was very fortunate to get in touch with Christian Allen, a veteran of the video game industry, a former Marine, and a lead designer at Red Storm Interactive for the 360 version of Advanced Warfighter. He shared some insight about how Graw's PC version took this form. The development of Graw for next-gen consoles, with the 360 as the lead, was started pretty early on. Actually, while development of the soon-to-be cancelled PC port of Ghost Recon 2 was still ongoing. Due to the timing problems with the PC SKUs and the cancellation of Ghost Recon 2 on the PC, it was decided that the PC version would be developed separately by a PC-focused studio and cater to the needs of the PC audience. When I asked Christian about whether or not he had any oversight of the development of this version, he gave me some details on Grin's attitude towards making Graw for the PC. We, as in Red Storm, were nose down in the 360 development, and basically left Grin to develop the PC version. From our point of view, I'm sure Ubisoft Paris had plenty of input. I know there was an early desire from Grin to focus on the PC audience, and since they never received Ghost Recon 2, they generally approached it as a sequel to the original Ghost Recon rather than a continuation of the series. I found this to be very intriguing and gave me more of an explanation to why so many elements of the tactical layout of the squad command system felt like a direct extension of the original Ghost Recons.
The results are a mixed bag. I'll start off by commending this version's approach to tactical planning and ordering your squad around. There is quite a lot of control you can give to your squad. You're able to map chains of orders for your squad or individual squad members and sequence whether instructions are executed all at once or until you're ready for them to commence your next order. This turns every map into a huge web of decisions, since you have to be far more conscious of your squad mates' survival and the best path they can take to execute maneuvers. Alternatively, you can scroll through orders with the mouse button and give directions on the fly. It's all surprisingly accessible, and I've yet to see something replicate this system since. This flexibility is probably this version's biggest appeal. Levels are far bigger than the 360 version, littered with enemies that will ambush you if you try to beeline it to your objective. Taking a far more methodical approach is almost always necessary.
Damn it! Mitchell, what's your status?
Enemies are ruthlessly accurate, being able to snipe you if you're only visible by a pixel, so finding the best sightline to them with the least exposure and the micromanagement of your squad members' sightlines is the optimal way to go. Like most tactical shooters similar to this game, there's a huge sense of tension that forbids the feeling of moving throughout the environment, scanning rooftops and down alleys that make unexpected encounters seriously intense. It harkens back to the original Ghost Recon really well in that sense, where minutes of coordinating maneuvers and moving through a level was suddenly interrupted by a short archaic firefight that honestly made me shit my pants the last time I played it. But whereas the first Ghost Recon had a firm grip of that type of pacing, this version of Advanced Warfighter has to share it with a huge amount of unpolish that ruins a lot of the enjoyment.
First off, this game's presentation hasn't aged very well one bit. It's obvious that this game is built for 1280 by 720 monitors because the render distance is horrifyingly short and it shows on a 1080p monitor. It's not hard to spot the silhouettes of enemies that are 150 meters away from you, but at 151 meters they begin to clip into the void of the unrendered. You gotta be fucking kidding me. This makes the only scope weapon in the game not really worth using.
Textures and models become clayed as they move into the distance as well. It's enough to really bother the eyes. If it weren't for these things, I'd say this game looks decent enough for mid-2000s, being somewhat on par with a Source game from the time.
Lighting is serviceable and the environments have a fair amount of detail, but the brown color palette of Mexico City is definitely more ugly on this version than the 360. Graphics aren't the only area where recessions have been made. Unfortunately, the over-the-top gunner sequences are completely absent on the PC, and the slickness of the cross-comm has been downgraded as well. Whereas in the 360 version, blue, green, and red lines would wrap around various NPCs and give them the appropriate NATO markings for what they were for. And your map was an interactive 3D model that was aesthetically meant to be a part of your integrated warfighting system. Now those slickly animated NATO symbols are replaced with red, blue, and green shapes that are obviously just PNGs with an alpha channel and transparency. Not a huge deal, but it doesn't have the same flair as the Xbox versions. The animation quality is also quite lacking. Character animations aren't particularly bad, in fact I'd say they're about average, but the weapon animations have to be some of the worst I've ever seen, especially when you're aiming down sights. Firing animations are very choppy and don't blend very well together, which can make aiming very difficult when using an automatic weapon, making the M249 an afterthought as well. These aren't the only technical issues that bleed into the gameplay. There are numerous asinine glitches that affect friendly and enemy AI that succeed at creating some fucking annoying moments, and some that will make you question your own existence. The poor AI heavily affects the execution of the squad mechanics, which is terrible considering how much more of a focus they are in this version. Although the cross-comm and order selection allows for some very creative maneuvers, it is weighed down heavily by the friendly AI who, just like in the 360 version, have a really friggin' difficult time traversing the terrain. This is all the more frustrating in this version since the emphasis on coordinating your team plays much more of a role. Moving around certain pieces of geometry can sometimes make these guys freeze up and lock in place, nor can you trust them to choose angles that don't have them completely outgunned. Responding to orders immediately can be difficult for them as well, especially if you've made a mistake by putting them out in the open and they begin engaging an enemy, since they will hyper-focus on combat and will ignore any given requests. If you've laid out a complicated plan and a teammate freezes up against a surface, you have to wait for him to unscrew himself or redo the entire sequence of orders, and it's just not worth the wait half the time. If you're insistent on keeping them alive through your playthrough, expect to do a lot of hand-holding. Other friendly AI have the same issues on a couple of instances.
Jesus Christ.
What makes this worse is that you can't control them by any means. Halfway through the game, you're given the task to escort tank crewmen to their tanks, but they don't want to be escorted and aren't concerned with trivial things like not walking into the line of sight of a machine gun nest. Even if it's right fucking in front of them. You can imagine why this part made me turn off the game for the night. Although Graal on the PC certainly has a unique design when it comes to how it handles squad commands, the AI taints basically all of it. Ironically, the levels that have you play without squad mates were the most enjoyable for me. These levels are obviously built around solo play, so the difficulty is ironed out and focuses more so on individual stealth and action rather than team strategy. There is some fun to be had in taking out legions of dudes on your lonesome, but there's no more charm to it than that. It's only enjoyable since I'm not having to babysit idiots, and I'm not constantly getting fucked up since all the enemies are condensed into one flank instead of them ambushing me from 3 different angles. In regular missions, when your teammates die, it's not a similar story to the cruisiness of the Lone Wolf missions, and things can get very difficult if they get killed due to how enemies are placed in these levels, which are numerous and all-encompassing. So if your teammates die, this can turn levels into a cycle of trial and erroring each area until you find a sequence of inputs that let you get past. Now, I understand trial and error comes with the train of tactical shooters like this because of their unforgiving nature, but in the case of this game, micromanaging your squad mates is far more burdensome than it should be, and coordination with them doesn't really give you much of a payoff. If the AI were more agile and receptive to your orders, they wouldn't be such a pain to take care of. But sadly, their biggest strength mostly amounts to drawing heat off of you in combat. Something I do appreciate this version for over the Xbox 360 is how much more customization you have over your weapons and teammates. Prior to starting a mission, you can customize your own primary and secondary weapons with different attachments, as well as your teammates, meaning you can specialize your squad a bit more to your liking. Now, your character does have a weight limit, but this only seems to affect your speed depending on how much you put on your guns. Something I greatly appreciate is how there are SMGs made available for secondary weapons to complement more specialized rules, even if the M249 and Barrett are kind of shit. Basically, I just liked how nothing is locked out. As already mentioned, some animations make certain weapons annoying to use, so as long as you're using a SCAR or XM8 variant as your primary with a red dot, you'll be able to shoot straight without too much fuss. There is something really peculiar about this customization though, and that is how the game doesn't give you any information about the level you're about to begin when you're in this customization screen. Why this is the case is beyond me, but it can make your loadout possibly very unpreferable for your next mission, since you never really know the type of objective you're going to be tasked until after you've created your loadout. So unless this is your second playthrough of this game for some reason, you won't know whether you should use a long distance loadout or a close quarters one. And if you do fuck up your loadout, trust me, you will, you can't revert back to the customization screen. Only the last checkpoint you had, which would have been in the previous level. Something that doesn't help is how you're unable to pick up enemy weapons in this version. So it's best to go with something safe. Like I said, I tended to just default to the XM8, which I found to be the most manageable multi-purpose weapon in the arsenal. And while we're on this subject, I just want to point out how broken this grenade launcher is. Like, it's literally broken. It does not work. I've tried every surface, every distance, every angle, and this thing just bounces off like a tennis ball.
Let's go,
Over there is
people!
the President's last known position.
Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter's PC version offers an experience completely different than that of its 360 counterpart, and is essentially an evolution of the original Ghost Recon in many respects. However, its execution prevents it from standing shoulder to shoulder to either the 360 version or the original. And I'll be honest, there are older games in the Tom Clancy catalog that focus around similar core mechanics that have aged far better than this one. Unfortunately, Ubisoft pulled this game from Steam in 2013, ironically, as well as all other online storefronts, so it's basically become abandonware. The only way to play it is with a CD or going downtown to talk to your local pirates.
While I found this game neat to begin with, it really didn't hold me for much of the time that I was playing it. Although there are some features I really did enjoy, the jankiness of the combat and AI are just too distracting for me, and they cause more frustration than it's honestly worth. Luckily, the exact same template and formula in this game is built upon and improved in Advanced Warfighter 2's PC version, and while many of the faults of this game are still present in that one, a lot of them were thankfully ironed out. So if this game does look like your cup of tea, forget this version altogether and find a way to play the sequel, as it's fundamentally the same game, just without a lot of the annoying baggage, and with some additional content. GRA on the 360 pushed the envelope for what was expected out of the next generation of consoles at the time, making it a tough act to follow for Ubisoft Shanghai, who would helm the project for the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox. With how cutting edge the engine that was being used to develop the 360 version, it wasn't going to be possible for Ubisoft Shanghai to merely port that version to its last-gen siblings. Christian explained to me that the last-gen versions of GRA on the original Xbox and PlayStation 2 became their own projects once it was decided that Ubisoft Shanghai would take lead on those SKUs. And with the engine tech that was being developed for GRA, it wasn't practical to do backwards support. Christian then went on to explain something that I found very interesting that I'd wondered about myself. Since Shanghai was on a separate tech base, directly porting the art assets wasn't viable, and so at that point it was decided to make essentially separate games. I had advocated using the Ghost Recon 2 Summit Strike core tech for the GRA last gen versions and doing more of an asset-based expansion pack, but the team at Ubisoft Shanghai wasn't experienced with Red Storm's tech pipeline, so they made the call. Hearing this had made me wonder about the possibility of the framework of Ghost Recon 2 being translated into the aesthetic of GRA for the original Xbox and PS2. Which, in my opinion, probably would have been more in line with the Xbox 360 version of GRA than the result of Ubisoft Shanghai's efforts, as the 360 version's multiplayer already borrows heavily from Ghost Recon 2's framework. Although, Ghost Recon 2 only could make a proper debut on the original Xbox, as the PlayStation 2 wasn't powerful enough to support it. So for the PlayStation 2, an entirely different game had to be made and dubbed as a prequel. Considering this, I have a feeling that if Christian's idea was brought to fruition, that a PlayStation 2 version might not have been possible. I want to start off by saying that this version was sort of the catalyst for wanting me to make this video. I had no idea this existed until very recently, and with how well the 360 version had aged and how janky the PC version ended up being, I anticipated that this could have gone either way. So I ordered a copy online, which I foolishly ordered to my old address, and decided to pull the tarp over my pink Barbie PlayStation. Now, I do want to note that there are some slight differences in the PlayStation 2 version that I played and the original Xbox version that Kacey played, so she'd like to give you an overview of that a little later. For the most part, this version surprised me. This game is a time capsule of sorts, where games that would release on the 6th generation consoles would attempt to appease their audiences in the shadow of their next generation counterpart. But you may be a bit surprised to see that while this is obviously a very downgraded version in just about every respect, it is still very faithful to replicating the 360 experience as best as it can. And for the most part, I'd say it's a commendable effort, but it doesn't quite tick all the boxes. The game is structured the same as the other two versions, taking place over the same 9 missions that are expectedly scaled way the hell down. All the central features, like the cross-comm and squad commands, are there and behave similarly to the 360 version, albeit there are some differences. The PlayStation 2 version still manages to recreate most of the other version's set pieces, if only in a far less spectacular way.
For instance, instead of escorting a column of tanks through a vast military base with various arenas filled with enemy armor and infantry, you follow a static model of a single tank that slides over a bridge and into a parking lot where you order it to take out a few static vehicles, thus completing the mission.
Hell, what do you expect from this old girl?
Other sequences like the helicopter gunner sections haven't made the cut, which wasn't a huge surprise, and the escape sequence where Mitchell is chased by a helicopter or squad of enemies in the PC version is completely absent on the PS2.
The objectives are the exact same as the other versions. You'll still defend the embassy in the second level, destroy artillery pieces in the night level, and save the president 2/3 of the way in. However, some changes have been made, and some objectives play out entirely differently.
For instance, the game's main antagonist, Carlos, doesn't get sniped off the top of the embassy building, but instead you chase him into the basement where you shoot at him on the other side of some metal bars. Oddly enough, you can complete this level by simply walking out the way you came in without killing Mendez, whereas in the 360 version, you have to kill him to complete the game. Missions are far more restrictive than the 360's by only having one very clear path to your objective, with a couple opportunities for experimentation, as in the odd alternative flank or sniping position. But for the most part there isn't much variation and things feel very A to B. In a couple of instances, levels do open up to give you the option of what objectives to take on first, but with how cramped the environments are that you fight in, it doesn't shake the linear feeling of most encounters. Engagements with enemies often happen in narrow streets with the odd car or two for cover, whereas in the 360 version, environments are sprawling with flanking opportunities and different pathways to get to your objective. And that's probably the biggest distinction of this version. Things are expectedly scaled way the hell down. Most environments that took 10 to 15 minutes to get to in either the PC or Xbox 360 version are reachable in 2 to 5, which had a huge effect on playtime as I was able to beat this game in under 5 hours, where the 360 version nearly took me twice as long. If there is any benefit to the levels being drastically smaller, it is that the frequency of enemy encounters are far greater than either the PC or 360, resulting in a lot less downtime. And I suppose it's in this respect where Advanced Warfighter on the PS2 is far more in line with the 360 version, with the moment-to-moment gameplay involving more shooting than coordinating. The tactical command elements play a far less of a role due to how narrow levels are structured, and since you don't even get a full squad to order around. Instead, you're restricted to a single squad member that can easily be forgotten about. Just like the 360 version, you control him with the same 2 simple orders. Movement or attack is up, and regroup or follow is down. Although it's tiresome to even command him to do anything because of this exaggerated wave animation that interrupts whatever you were doing. And since the difficulty is scaled way down, most of the missions I was just able to beeline it to the objective and never felt it was hard enough to call my single squad mate for help. In addition to this, many of the sequences that had you commanding various combined units with the cross-comm haven't made the cut on the PS2 as well, and the ones that have been reduced to not even a third of the length as they were in the 360, really reducing the amount of time you actually get to use the cross-comm. The gunplay is surprisingly not terrible, but by no means is perfect. This shift in perspective results in the absence of the cover system in the 360 version. To compensate for this, holding down on L1 and pushing the left stick either left or right allows you to lean like in the PC version. However, it feels very wonky, and as precise movement isn't a strength at all in this game, it's another feature that I refused to utilize while I was playing. Understanding that silky smooth aiming isn't something that a lot of shooters got right on the PlayStation 2, GRA is somewhat serviceable. Aiming is fine in areas where frame rates are more manageable,
but unfortunately that is about half the time. I was able to find some enjoyment in some of the smaller gun battles that took place on more than one axis where things ran smoothly, but they aren't anything very spectacular. But when the frame rate begins to dip to the mid-teens as levels become larger and filled with more enemies, you often have to resort to closing the distance between you and your enemies in order to keep your crosshair on target, something that is sure to be frustrating in any type of shooter. So when you're tasked to defend an area and enemies begin reaching your left and right flanks, things can get difficult as the input delay makes turning 90 degrees difficult without over or under aiming. Luckily, there is almost always an abundance of turrets in these instances that alleviate having to fight the frame rate, but it doesn't remedy this issue and turns defending an area into an almost boresome act where you hold the trigger and push the stick left and right. If the frame rate wasn't so problematic, I would say things wouldn't be too bad, but with how much this version's gunplay still maintains a focus on precision, although not as much as the other two versions, the potential enjoyment is sucked dry by this issue. With enemies' inaccuracy and the generous health model in comparison to the other versions, the PlayStation 2 gives more wiggle room to running and gunning tactics, although it never strays too much away from giving the player the means to be lethal at a distance, and this is mainly felt by each weapon's characteristics. While the aiming is not as smooth as the 360, each gun still has a fire selector, and oddly enough, Mitchell always carries a sniper rifle variant on him by default, which I found interesting as the other versions don't even allow you to hold more than one primary weapon at a time, so those tricky shots are never out of the question, and you have some flexibility with what range you can engage at. However, this is downplayed by the less of an importance that sightlines play, since firearms aren't nearly as lethal as the other two versions, in both your hands and the Rebels. Mitchell is able to take far more than a couple rounds, and with enemies' reluctance to engage you at a distance larger than 50 or so meters, something that can be easily exploited if you haven't alerted them, standing out in the open and strafing left and right is far more applicable than on the 360. Not to mention, the frequency of the resupply points that double as a healing station is far greater in this version due to the shortened length of missions, so you can always get away with playing a bit more mindlessly. This doesn't ruin anything particularly, but it changes the flavor of this version a lot by making it feel much more like a straightforward generic FPS than a shooter built around lethal gun battles, something that had always been a selling point of Ghost Recon up to this point. As for the Xbox version, well, Kacey, take it away.
For the last 15 years, Microsoft and Sony have generally been pretty even footing in terms of console performance. Sure, there's always been a winner, but both companies' offerings for the 7th and 8th generation were both leaps and bounds ahead of anything Nintendo had to offer. So it's weird to think that just 2 generations back, Sony was actually the one trailing far behind. The Microsoft Xbox and, believe it or not, the Nintendo GameCube were both much stronger than the PS2 in terms of raw power. But whether that difference would be illustrated in games was all up to the developers. Mr. W felt like we needed to look at the Xbox version to give Graw a fair shake, and since it's my platform of choice, we decided that I should be the one to do it. Listen, I've seen my fair share of lazy PS2 and Xbox ports in my day. It's not uncommon at all, not even from big publishers or well-remembered best-selling games. The PS2 massively outsold the Xbox for so many reasons that I can't even go into them here without taking a massive detour. But to make a long story short, Sony enjoyed a crushing victory despite the PS2's anemic specs. Now, understandably, developers made sure that their games would run on the most popular hardware first, sometimes at the expense of quality on the more capable platforms. Graw is not the worst offender, but it is definitely not fine-tuned for the Xbox. Previous Ghost Recon games, Rainbow Six 3, and Operation Flashpoint Elite prove that this console was more than capable of handling a large-scale tactical shooter. Instead, the last-gen consoles got this substandard version where the primary design goal was to look like the real game. It is what it is, and to its credit, the game ended up receiving a number of small improvements over the PS2 version. The most obvious difference is in the frame rate. It's better than the mid-teens experience in the PS2, that much is clear, but it is just as inconsistent. The frame rate doesn't have a cap, so when in tight, small areas, it rockets up to the mid-40s or even low 50s. But when stepping out into larger areas, encountering an enemy, or even just firing your weapon, it's liable to drop down into the low 20s. Look, frame rates in the low 20s are playable. Console gamers have been putting up with them since the dawn of 3D. But things are a bit different when the frame rate constantly fluctuates. Go play a PC game at 60 FPS for an hour, then set the limit at 30. It's going to feel bad for a while. Once you get used to 30, it's fine, but the problem is with Graw, you don't get time to adjust to it. Instead, you have to get used to the fluctuation, which put plainly, not everyone is going to be able to do. The logical solution to this would have been just to lock the frame rate at 30. A drop from 30 to 20 is a lot less noticeable than a drop from 50 to 20. The differences are not limited to performance, though. I have both versions of this game, and the differences in design are minor, but noticeable. Enemies on the Xbox are animated more smoothly than the PS2, weapon models are different, graphics are a bit more detailed, and scopes work differently. There's no reload animation on the PS2, while the Xbox actually has them. But on the other hand, the load times are absolutely insane, even by optical media standards. The view model FOV is ridiculously low, and the Xbox version is missing the survival and terrorist hunt modes from the PS2. Truth told, I didn't hate my cursory experience with this game. Not that I loved it, but because I play a lot of games from this era, I'm capable and willing to overlook elements that maybe haven't aged all that gracefully. I was wondering if all these little hitches and quirks were just symptoms of large-scale tactical shooters during this console generation, so I went back and tried Rainbow Six 3 and the original Ghost Recon. These games are both much different in focus than GRAW, so a direct comparison really isn't possible. But this little experiment did make me realize what it was about GRAW on the Xbox that didn't sit right with me. The original Ghost Recon is challenging in a way that is neither frustrating nor arbitrary. In Ghost Recon 1, you're fighting the enemy. In Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter, you're fighting the controller. GR1 suffers minor frame rate problems and the jumpy controls that come with it, with the slower pace, clearer graphics, and less crowded environments meaning that these issues are more tolerable. But even separate from technical issues, GRAW just feels watered down. The biggest loss in my opinion was the squad element. In classic Ghost Recon games, planning and organizing your team was the difference between success and failure. The tide in any individual fight could be completely turned by patient strategy, and trying to go full Rambo was a death sentence. In Advanced Warfighter, failing to give Ramirez an appropriate order just means more work for the player, with no true consequence. Make no mistake, even with the 360 version of GRAW, Ubisoft ditched the hardcore formula that built the Ghost Recon brand in the first place. But at least that version was polished, feature complete, and it gave the player something resembling a tactical experience. I'm glad I agreed to help Mr. W out with this video, because while I didn't love Advanced Warfighter, it got me to give a second look to the original Ghost Recon, and I have to say, it grabbed me in ways that no game has in a long time.
Before wrapping this up, I thought it'd be interesting to give a brief overview of the changes made between the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox, starting with the graphics. The Xbox version features more effects than the PlayStation 2 for things like bolt impacts, explosions, and car windows that can be broken. Shadows are baked into the environments in both versions, but the Xbox can accommodate real-time shadows for your lone teammate. Aesthetically, the most noticeable difference would have to be the HUD. On the Xbox, the ammo counter and health meter are curved, and the minimap is moved to the top right-hand corner, and plays for the cross-comm that feeds your lone squadmate's perspective, just like the PC and Xbox 360. The PS2 version, on the other hand, only suffices with the minimap that has been moved to where the cross-comm is on the Xbox. As Kacey mentioned before, weapon models on the Xbox take up an obnoxious amount of the screen, whereas the PlayStation 2, they are fortunately at a more reasonable distance. As for the weapon models themselves, the Xbox version sports greater detail overall, and some tiny differences from the PlayStation 2 for some reason. For instance, the MRC rifle has additional postings on the front and back of the scope in the Xbox version, and the SCAR-L doesn't have a front sight in the PlayStation 2 version. Animations have been completely scuffed down on the PlayStation 2 version for the most part. There is no ragdoll effects to speak of whatsoever, and enemies are animated at a noticeably lower frame rate than the Xbox, giving them a slideshow-like quality. In place of the reloading animations that are absent on the PlayStation 2, a meter appears and gradually fills up when Mitchell fires his weapon empty. This is something I wasn't expecting the original Xbox's hardware to give an advantage on. The most significant area where changes have been made though would have to be the level design and difficulty. The Xbox and PlayStation 2 have entirely different levels in terms of layout and overall scale, with the PlayStation 2 version cutting out complete segments and set pieces found in the Xbox version. A small example is that the first mission begins with an opening sequence where you start off in the back of a helicopter getting briefed. You then land on a small rooftop and walk down some ramps to begin the level. On the PlayStation 2, the brief is given to you in the loading screen and the mission cuts to the alley where you begin the mission, with the planks you walk down in the Xbox version being nowhere in sight. But the changes don't stop there. There are numerous alterations to the areas where levels open up into larger arenas on the Xbox that are completely cut out of the levels in the PlayStation 2 version in favor of narrow streets, ultimately giving the Xbox version levels nearly double the playtime, resulting in a longer game overall. And as Kacey mentioned, there are far less loading screens on the Xbox. So it's pretty clear that the Xbox version is a few steps ahead here. But what's peculiar to me about the differences in these two versions is how evident Ubisoft Shanghai's willingness to compromise different aspects in the PlayStation 2 version is just to get it to a playable state. The compromises like the level size and enemy counts make sense, but it seems they were really scraping the bottom of the bucket in order to optimize this thing, which unfortunately only resulted in a watered down version of an already watered down version. Gra has become near and dear with me due to the frustration I incurred with Shitpoint. And while I'd say the majority of these versions gave me more frustration than I was hoping for, it's given me a new appreciation for Gra by the lengths that Ubisoft was willing to go to in order to give every system a playable version of this game, regardless of the compromises it would take. And in the case of the PC version, allowing a complete deviation from the direction of the base game. I wouldn't say any of the results are very spectacular, but I think the effort is commendable nonetheless. Creating essentially 3, arguably 4, completely different games under the banner of one title is something that will probably never happen again for a AAA title, and well, for good reason. And I'll leave it at that. If you guys are looking at getting into this game, play the 360 version. There is some fun to be had with the PC version, but the sequel is much more up to standard, and even still, old school Rainbow and Ghost Recon are still vastly superior in every way. And the PlayStation 2 and Xbox versions are, well, shit tier, and I wouldn't wish them on my worst enemy. Anyway guys, this video was originally conceptualized to only take a couple weeks, but as I found information and awareness of the subject was small to say the least, I felt an obligation to increase the scope of the video. What was originally meant to be a 20-minute video, no more, ended up becoming nearly an hour long. So I apologize for the wait. I'd also like to give Kacey a huge thanks for lending me a hand. If you like videos on subjects similar to this, you should absolutely check out her channel. Thanks for watching you guys, and don't forget to sub for the suck.